laugh a lot. Hey, everybody. Apparently, Mike King does nothing but have fun and laugh a lot. I got caught out yet again by Anton starting it. I think he picks the moment when I'm saying something slightly strange. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Brilliant. Absolutely delighted to have you. You get the song. A quick hello to start the show. Welcome to the show, Mike King.
It's a wonderful song. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. I hear you're a musician as well, and David was saying you were going to rap at me.
It's definitely not going to happen, but yes, I'm a musician.
Brilliant. So, two musicians meet. I play double bass and you rap. Is that correct?
That's true. Yep.
Right, and I'm the world's worst rapper, and you can probably hear that from my initial song because it.
Well, lucky for you, I'm the best rapper ever.
Very good point. I'm a punk folk musician, so I would now say I'm the best punk folk double bassist because I'm probably the only punk folk double bassist.
Nice.
That's easy. Right, we're going to start with your brand SERP. Oh, welcome everybody else. We're going to start with the brand SERP, and what I do is look at people's brand SERP, and here we go. Michael King in the UK. It's a jewelry shop, and then if we look at it in the US, it's a baseball player.
For the Yankees.
Then we look at it in Australia, or is it New Zealand? No, it's New Zealand. And it's a New Zealand-born historian. Then we look at Ireland, and we get Michael #1 of Romania, strangely enough. Then we look in India, and it gives us several choices. It's not sure which one we're looking for. And then we look in South Africa, and it gives us pictures and choices, and basically what I found really interesting here, and because your name is so common, is that depending on where you are in the world, Google will show you the person or the entity, the jewelry shop in the UK that it thinks is the most probable.
Here's a funny thing that a lot of people don't know. If you go back to or you probably still have it on your screen, the pictures that it's showing in that last SERP, there's a picture of Martin Luther King Jr.
Is that?
Yeah, almost like the second from the right at the top.
Wow.
Because his birth name was Michael King.
Wonderful. Don't we find out some incredibly interesting things from brand SERPs when we know what to look for?
Yeah, it's crazy.
Brilliant. Oh, I learned something new. In fact, I learned a lot of new things. I learned about the vast number of Michael Kings there are in the world, but there is only one Michael King SEO. Now, do you call yourself Michael King or Mike King?
When I write it out, I usually put Michael because it looks cooler, but most people call me Mike.
Right, because I actually singing Mike King is quite difficult, whereas Michael King is much easier.
Exactly. And also it's My Cool King.
I just feel so stupid not to have noticed. So today is a day of learning, and we're going to carry on with the day of learning with content engineering. Now, my first question is, what do you mean by content engineering, Mike?
Yeah, I think what most people call semantic SEO is what I call content engineering, because of this is the act of what you actually do to make it happen. And so, a few years ago when I was like, it depends isn't enough for me because everybody says it depends is the answer to everything. I'm like, okay, what does it depend on? And so I really started to dig more into understanding of information retrieval and so on. And so that's when I learned more about how do search engines actually look to understand content. And so as many of us know, they break it down pages into paragraphs, into sentences, into words, into entities, and so on. And so the act of, actually optimizing for that statistical understanding that search engines develop of content is what I call content engineering. So a lot of the work that you're doing around entities, a lot of the work that people do around co-occurrence and, just the various things that you have to do in your content to account for what Google expects. That's what I call content engineering.
So, content engineering would include what you do, co-occurrence, which is Dawn Anderson's favorite thing, and context clouds, which are Bill Slawski's favorite thing, and that idea of building. Kare Guber was on 2 weeks ago, in fact, talking about building a page around a specific entity and then tagging other smaller entities or slightly less relevant entities onto that. You're talking basically about the same thing.
Yeah, effectively. And then we're also talking about things like topical clusters, so building out a whole section around the various topics that go around it. So you're also getting back into like the ideas of siloing to some degree, and all these concepts that have kind of been presented in SEO as like, by themselves. And basically what I'm saying is you take all those concepts and put it together, and that's content engineering. Because it's one thing to be like, okay, well, let me get my target keyword and put it in here. It's another thing to think about, okay, what are the entities that are expected around this keyword? What are the co-occurring terms? What are the series of pages that you need to build around it? And if you zoom out and think about like how that's actually done in web professions, that's like a combination of information architecture, content strategy,
Right.
SEO, and so on. And there wasn't just like one name for it. And I would like go into these meetings like, yeah, we're going to do technical content optimization. And that's like a mouthful. But if you say something like content engineering, it's like, oh, that sounds cool. We're not doing that, right? And so it's really just like a good packaging of a variety of things that we are already doing in SEO.
Right, brilliant. And does that allow you then to say, my strategy of content engineering comes from reverse engineering Google, which would be pretty cool?
Yeah, pretty much. And, like the way I always explain it is no one knows Google's algorithms and so on, but we can determine what they think is valuable by parsing out those pages using natural language processing, and then looking at what these features are, and then create content that kind of map to those features. And I'm not saying like, oh, let's do just like a really complex version of keyword stuffing. I'm saying like, how do we actually talk about these same subjects and make it make sense to what a user wants and also align with what Google wants. I always talk about things in terms of personas and so on, and I've always thought of Google as like just one of those personas.
Ooh,
and
that's
I think
nice.
Yeah, and I think of AJ Cohn. He's like personified it in a great way. He calls it like the blind 5-year-old. And so to that end, we're just kind of incorporating Google as a persona by like building out these very in-depth briefs, leveraging natural language processing to understand what are these pages made up of, so that we can write pages that effectively tick those boxes while continuing to be natural to actual users.
Right. And so in fact, Google isn't a persona in and of itself, in the sense that you're making a page for two personas each time in that case. The human persona and Google's persona is the same across all your pages, with a different facing human persona who you're actually building for.
Well, I hate to say that it depends, but it depends. And what I mean by that is,
you said you wouldn't say that.
No, but I'm gonna tell you what it depends on. Whereas most SEOs,
brilliant.
Like,
Sorry,
it depends. Anyway, so like if you're doing something for Google News, and that Google persona is a little different than if you're doing it for like standard ranking and so on. And same thing for local. And so to that end, we probably have like 4 or 5 Google personas that we may be thinking about. But the whole point is that when we're thinking about content, we never not think about Google. And typically when people are making content, they're like, oh, we're making content for the user now. We're not thinking about Google. We're not doing SEO content. But I don't believe in the concept of SEO content, right? Like, you're either going to make content that performs or content that doesn't perform. And, you can make content that's either going to perform organically, or you can make content that's going to perform through paid media. But I'd rather you make content that works for all of that, rather than being like, oh yeah, this is the content that's for people, and this is the content for search engines. Like, that's not valuable at this stage.
But that, from my perspective, kind of that comes into. I tend to say, make the content for the user. You've got to figure out where you're going to be reaching out to them, on paid or on social or on this platform, on that platform, and then package it for Google. And now I would be able to say, package that content for the Google persona you're aiming at.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
That would make sense.
Again, and I just to be clear, like, I don't think that we should ever be thinking of those as like separate pieces of content, right? Like, you just have to have your series of personas, because typically when people are making content, it might be 2, 3, 4 personas that they're thinking about, and that introduces like the constraints or the requirements for the page, and Googlebot is just another requirement. So the more that you keep all that together, the less likely you have to like have SEO come in after the fact. I think Adam Audette said it best, SEO should be invisible. And so when you're having to do it after the fact, you're like shoehorning keywords into content That's when you get that awkward stuff that no one wants to see.
Yeah.
But if you have it baked in from the beginning, as we always say, and you do it in a good strategic way, that's when you make something that serves all purposes.
Right. I mean, so baking it in from the beginning, I mean, how do you go about that? Because you're saying, well, I've got this content, I'm building it for a persona. I need to engineer it, both for the persona, the human persona, but also for the Google persona I'm aiming at. How do you make sure you're baking it in from the beginning so that packaging becomes simple?
Yeah, absolutely. So it really just comes down to effective briefing for your content, right? Like typically when you make a piece of content, there is a brief of some sort, unless you're just gonna like go out and be like, oh, I got the subject, I'm gonna write about it. Let's see what happens. But especially if you're working in the environment that we work in as an agency, we have to say like, hey, here's the idea. Now here's how we want to execute that idea. And in that brief, you have the opportunity to say, okay, here are the personas that we're targeting. Here are the keywords that we should use. Here's the topics that we need to cover. Here's the questions that we need to answer. Here's the structured data that we want to use. And so that way, when you build this pretty robust brief, everyone that's creating content knows like, okay, I need to account for these things. And then ultimately, if what's turned in, whether it's by the client or by us or whatever, if it doesn't meet those expectations, then we haven't met the requirements and we don't publish that piece of content. So my whole point here is that you just have to document what you want and then use that as the guiding principles for what it is that you're creating. And, typically people are doing it the other way where it's like, okay, the brief says we need to write this for this audience. And here's what we think this audience wants to hear, but it's not so data driven. It tends to be more qualitative. It tends to be like, you're reacting to what sales told you to make or what the hippo told you that you need to make and things like that. This is a more data driven approach that accounts for all the requirements for this content to actually work.
Right. And so when you're giving the content brief to the content writers, do you include the concept of schema markup, or is that going to scare them away?
So on that end, it depends on what type of content we're making. And so, if we're talking about like a product detail page, right, then we're going to have to say like, yeah, let's account for schema as you're writing this. But if it's something like, an about us page, perhaps schema is kind of secondary there, and we only got to mark up like the address or something like that, right? And so you don't have to tell the writer to account for it, but it is something we would still put in the brief so that when that piece of content is handed off to dev, it is still accounted for. Right. So just to be clear, when I say it depends, I give you options. I don't say like, oh, it depends, go figure it out.
Right, yeah. And for people who are just listening to the audio version, Anton put "it depends" on the screen, and that really put Mike off. He started laughing and then forgot what he was saying. I just quickly coming back to the About Us page. The Kalicube tool is actually based on the idea of the entity home, and the entity home is the about page of the entity. And I would argue that, in fact, the text that you write for an about page is phenomenally important to Google's understanding. And that there aren't content writers out there, or I haven't found any, who can write a really good About Us text that isn't self-centered, that is factual, and yet is attractive. And then the schema markup would then map to that. So that, I think, is from my perspective at least, something that where I would say, yes, I would actually tell them this is the information we're trying to get in because that's what we're representing in the schema.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I was just using that as an example.
Brilliant. Okay. Sorry, I didn't want to contradict you and be very rude, but from my perspective, you happen to put the finger on one of my hobby horses.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So I love the product description, obviously, or the product page. You would need this for the about page. I would say you need it. What about a piece of content that's more general and attractive to the users in terms of that higher up the funnel content? Would you be talking about schema, or would that scare the content?
No, I think schema definitely can come to play there, especially when you start thinking about like Q&A, FAQ stuff. It all depends on what the content is about, because obviously, as we all know, like there's a variety of different vocabularies that can be implemented using schema. And so to that end, if we believe that there is an opportunity, we will put that in the brief and say, okay, make sure you structure this in such a way that it's going to be conducive to that. And we're also seeing like more of those annotations in the SERP where it's like it's not explicitly structured data, it's not like schema or anything, but it may be like a table or something like that, we're going to try to account for that as well, because, you know, we know that those are good places to take up more real estate in the SERP and give you more visibility. So again, as we're going through and we're saying like, this is what this content needs to be about, even if it's existing content, we're saying like, think about structuring it this way as you're writing it or as you're adjusting it.
Right. And how much detail do you go into for the headings? Because obviously they're very important. Do you impose them, or do you allow or do you suggest the content writers write as they feel?
Yeah, we suggest they write as they feel. You know, we will give like keyword driven you know, questions that we recommend answering. A lot of times they'll lift them or make adjustments to them, but we really leave it up to them because we want it to be as natural as possible. And we'll give them feedback as they, you know, turn things in and say like, hey, maybe you might want to restructure this around this phrase a bit better or something like that. But we definitely want to work from something that is more like from their head, because if we start writing as SEOs, then we all get into this like very linear thinking around the keywords. So it's better to have something from an actual writer. And I've always been a big proponent of this, that like copywriters should be the ones writing the content that we're talking about. Like even, you know, metadata. I've always believed that copywriters should be writing that, because if you think about something like a meta description, you know, it's not just about shoving the keyword in there a bunch of times. It's about using that as kind of like the advertising tagline for the page in the SERP. And that's always going to be better written by a copywriter than an SEO.
Brilliant. That's absolutely delightful. Now, the next question is, how do you weave images and videos into that?
Yeah. So images, I mean, so I'm kind of in a weird place about images, because Google obviously has the technology at this point to use computer vision to understand what an image is. Like they've got APIs you can use for that. And it's clear that they're using something similar to that in videos for YouTube. That's how they're being able to say that, in a combination of like natural language processing and text or speech to text, they can understand like where specifically in a video something is being talked about. But I don't see enough evidence that that's being used in like wide distribution on web pages. Obviously, that's computationally expensive. So it's still, from my perspective, about surrounding the images with copy that's relevant to the image, using alt tags, file naming, and so on. And we also give recommendations around that, like basically like, hey, if this image is about this thing, use the keywords to talk about it, use the keywords to name the image file, and so on. So it's still pretty basic as far as that. And then with videos, it's still about, you know, leveraging those transcripts and marking those up effectively, and so on. So I don't think much has changed around that, but I suspect in the next few years, we're going to have different conversations about it, because of the fact that Google does have the technology to support understanding this content in ways that it didn't before. Right.
So, I mean, a lot of kind of people are now saying, well, we need videos, we need images, we need to enrich our content. You're saying that isn't necessarily the case.
No. I definitely believe we should enrich the content,
right.
You know, partly from a UX perspective, because as we all know, the more structure, the more imagery and so on a piece of content, the better it performs.
Yeah.
Like you can do side by side where it's like, you know, an article written by the same person that's like a block of text versus something that's well structured with heading tags and images and videos. It's going to have higher time on site, more shares, more links every single time. So there's value. There's like second order value to it. I don't think it's inherently more valuable from an SEO perspective.
Right. Very good point. And the other question, kind of when you're doing this content brief, do you build that in? I.e., do you build in the idea of user engagement? Do you get the people creating the content to think about how users are going to engage and how they can keep them engaged?
Yes. And you know, that's kind of like generally in our idea of this concept of like 10x content that we always try to go after. So it's like, you know, what does 10x content look like? It's going to be, like I said, very well structured, a variety of different media assets and so on. And just more from the perspective of like, we know this is going to yield better UX metrics. So let's continue to go in that direction.
Oh, brilliant. Wonderful. Now, next question is the structure of the silos or the ontologies or the categorization, whatever you would call it. How do you go about that? Do you plan all that meticulously in advance and say, this is the content plan for the next year, and this is how it's all going to fit together?
Exactly. We actually have a deliverable called the content plan that we do that lays all that stuff out. We also have an information plan that lays out, like, let's say we're talking about a new website. We lay out the taxonomy, we lay out the tagging structure, internal linking structures, all of that, so the site can be built in a way that's going to be conducive to search. And, you know, that's another aspect of this that I didn't mention when I talk about content engineering, which is the IA components. Of like, how does all this stuff tie together? What does the navigation look like? How do we reinforce these concepts within the site, in addition to whatever's going on with the external linking structures and so on? So yeah, all of that is very much baked in and thought through. And, you know, it tends to be difficult for an existing site because you have to make them make a very big shift in this direction. But some clients are very open to it. You know, we've had clients that have collapsed their navigations pretty significantly, and it's yielded better performance. So yeah, all of that is stuff that we're thinking through, and it's all going to be keyword driven. And our keyword research is very driven around, you know, going back to the personas. Like, we're mapping keywords to the personas that are most likely to search for them. And so you're not really talking about Googlebot in that case, because obviously Googlebot is where you search, or Google is where you search. But we're mapping keywords that way so that it can inform the content strategy. And also, to some degree, that may inform how we think about entities as well. Because if we know that there's an entity that's related to a given persona more so, then we're going to say, okay, well, maybe we make one piece of content speaking specifically to this persona, leveraging these entities, and another piece of content that goes for the other personas and what have you, so that we can make sure that there's direct alignment between, you know, the searcher and the content that they're looking for. And I think that that's a bit of a departure for a lot of people, because we tend to think like, okay, this one page is for this one keyword and it's supposed to go to all audiences. Because obviously anyone can search for anything, but we're trying to think of like, how do we make this actually resonate with the searcher that we're trying to get to do a thing? And so it may require that we target the same keyword differently on different pages.
Right. Okay. And then from your perspective, Google gets that intent and gets the difference between the different approaches, and will rank them for the different circumstances.
Right. Exactly. And I believe that, you know, that's the future of Google, being like hyper personalized, like even more personalized than what you just showed by location being different for my name. I think that we're going to have like these very like micro audiences that Google is going towards. And you're seeing that their data is pushing in more of that direction, right? Like they have like the affinity targets that you can do in like paid and so on. Right. And I think that at some point they're going to say, okay, well, you, based on your user history and what we know about you and the places that you've gone and so on, you searching for this query, you mean specifically this. And so I think what's going to happen is you're going to have multiple pages about that same subject on your site so that they can tie you directly to that as a result.
Oh, I like that idea. That's jolly exciting, isn't it? But in fact, I mean, as you said, Michael King is an amazingly good example of one keyword, but multiple entities, multiple pages, multiple intents, depending on the geo region in our case. But then again, it could be that the Michael King, the baseball player, isn't interesting for somebody who's into academic history.
Exactly. Like,
and
what if I don't care about baseball? Don't show me that guy.
Yeah, so great, wonderful. People's names are an amazing way to start researching this upcoming revolution in SEO and optimizing for Google that Mike's just explained. Now, the next question along is, how do you do that at scale? I mean, from here, what I've seen is lots of meticulous work to get it all sorted out, getting the client to buy into this. I mean, getting them to buy into the micro idea, isn't that quite difficult as well before we go on to the scale?
No, absolutely. So the micro idea is definitely hard to get them to buy into, but at the same time, it's actually no different from keyword research in general, right? Like for you to buy into the idea that I need to figure out what keywords people are searching for, and then I provide the content related to that, this is just an expansion on that same idea on how you can do it better. And so how you scale it, I mean, it really just comes down to technologies, right? Like there's a variety of tools out there that help you to some degree get close to this. And when I say to some degree, I mean that I don't believe that the way these tools are doing it is an accurate reflection of how Google is understanding these concepts. You know, like when you think of of some of the tools that are out there, it's like, okay, you put in the keyword, it looks at the top 20 results, and then it teases out features from those pages and says like, okay, you got to talk about these entities, you got to use these words. But I think that Google is doing that across queries to better understand it. And again, this kind of goes back to the whole concept of like, named entity recognition and how it works. They're deriving information about a given entity across a ton of pages. And so it doesn't make sense to just look at an individual query to do this. You'd have to kind of look at the query space, so the collection of queries on that topic, to understand what Google is expecting around these different subjects. And so what I'm saying here is that these tools are getting you a part of the way there, but they're not doing it at the way that Google is likely doing it.
Yeah, I mean, that brings to mind two different things. One of which is we don't know what Google knows, i.e. what it understands, so we don't know which parts to tickle. And the other is, as a human being, a lot of this is down to my own intuition about what my persona is looking for, because that eventually is where Google is going.
Absolutely. And we don't know, but again, like, Google's not magic. Like, if an engineer was to join Google, they would look for someone who has experience with natural language processing, right? They're looking for someone who understands machine learning. They're looking for a variety of these different things. That there are a lot of open source projects that Google contributes to. There's a lot of things. There's a lot of like history behind information retrieval that we can look at and have a reasonable understanding of what they might be doing. And so that's a lot of the work that we do here at iPullRank, is like, don't allow us to just be like, it depends. Like, let's try a bunch of different libraries and see how close we can get to what we think Google is doing, and then test out what those outputs look like in our optimization, and then just keep going from there until we get to the sweet spot of performance. And we've been very successful with that. So, I'm not going to sit here and say I know how Google works, but I think I'm pretty close.
Brilliant. And how much of this analysis and the work that you do is based on your studying of information retrieval?
Most of it, there's a lot that I learned just like being in the SEO community, but, I guess I'm kind of similar to Dawn Anderson in that she's farther on than me, because she's like getting degrees in this stuff and so on. But, it just wasn't enough for me to be kind of like, I look at SEOs as kind of like power users of Google, right? Like, we know in and out how Google works, how to use Google. We don't necessarily know in and out how Google works, but we know advanced operators. We know how to use the search console. But at the end of the day, we're just users. We're just users who keep playing with the inputs and then keep trying to make things work. And it's a lot of like guess and check, but there's a lot that you can learn from, the computer science behind all this stuff that can make your guess and check a lot more precise. And so my background is computer science. And so it didn't scare me to like really dig into this stuff. And once I did, I was like, yeah, there's a lot of things in our space that people are just wrong about. And so I've just been able to work with my team to develop a series of hypotheses that we've been able to, try and see what works. And we've really just like developed more of this content engineering concept, and it's been very successful in the things that we do.
Brilliant. Okay. And coming back to the idea of scale, I mean, you said basically a lot of these tools don't really help you to scale. I mean, is there a possibility to scale this, or are we kind of stuck on a case-by-case basis?
No. So what I'm trying to say is that those tools will get you close, but I think there's just like a wide chasm between what those tools are doing and what Google is doing. Right. But at the same time, anything you do in that direction is better than like just shoving one keyword into the page 50 times like people were doing back in 2003. So I definitely recommend that people continue to use tools like a SERP for SEO or Write content success tool, or Phrase, or Market News, or there's any number of them. Search Metrics is Content Experience. Those are all great steps in the right direction. I just don't know that they are as good as what we need them to be. And so we're using stuff like that, but then we also have further analysis that we do on our end using, libraries like Spacey and so on and so forth, so that we can get even closer to what it is that Google is doing. So it may be like a first pass using one of those tools and then bringing all that in. And then we do our comparisons even further with like little scripts that we've written ourselves. And then we further optimize from there.
Right. And then you have your plan. And is that when the human intuition comes in and the creativity you were talking earlier on about let the content writers write content?
Exactly.
So basically it's creating a foundation for them and a clear guideline or a clear work explanation that they can then create on top of. And that creativity, is there a point at which that might kill the preparation work if they push it too far? Do you need to kind of say to them, you need to not push this too far?
Well, I think it's the same as like any creative stuff we do in business, right? Like, if you have a designer and you're like, here's a design brief, at some point they're probably going to go off the rails and there has to be revision, right? So It's not often that, especially when it's a third party, that we hand off one of these briefs and they get it right the first time. There's always going to need to be that feedback loop between us and them. But you're going to get more value out of letting them start with the constraints in mind than if they just wrote without it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so the constraints are guide rails, and you would expect people to leave those guide rails. But I mean, it's like Andrea Volpini at WordLift talks a lot about kind of humans and machines dancing together, and that sounds very similar. I love the idea of it because I've got this image in my head of people dancing with machines, which is perhaps not so far from the truth.
Yeah, absolutely.
And well, the next one is kind of practical applications. I mean, from this perspective, we've talked a lot about theory. We haven't really given any kind of specific examples. Have you got specific examples where this has worked for you that you can share?
I mean, we do it all the time. Like, so the example that I often share is we had a client where we didn't have any link building as part of our engagement. So all we could do really, as far as like the individual content pieces after we've done the technical work, was do these types of optimizations. So it's a really competitive space. It was like Medicare supplement insurance or something like that, like something that's very difficult. And the keywords are all high volume. And so all we did was these optimizations, and then across like a 3-month period, those pages like went from ranking 50 to like 3 and 1 and something like that for all the queries that we targeted. So that's one of the other points that I make when I talk about this concept of content engineering, is that as SEOs, what we typically do is we do your site audit, you make your like technical adjustments, you fix your broken links, your standard like rel canonical tag, all that type of stuff. And then the next thing you typically do is either make content or start building links to content. And those are like your primary things that people do in this space. And when you think about Google's algorithms, which are technically called scoring functions, you think of it as like a giant equation. And so what we do as SEOs is we kind of like over-index on the part of the equation that is the link side of things. And all of these components of the equation have weights to them, right? So what Google does is they'll like turn the weight down on the link stuff, and then suddenly there's a shuffling around. But the point that I make is that the weight on the content aspects are actually higher than we give them credit for. And so there have been instances where, again, like no link activity at all, and we've just focused on that, and we seen huge jumps in rankings just from that. So what I try to impress on people when they ask me about content engineering and so on, is like, try doing that before you do any of the new content, any of the link building. See how far that gets you first, and then start doing some of that other stuff.
Right. Yeah. I mean, people tend to immediately jump to new content, to link building. And one of the nicest or most effective things to do is to already focus on what you've got and just make it better. Engineer it better, in your term. Package it better would be my term, which is terribly, terribly true. But so you're looking at this from a perspective of saying we don't necessarily need links or a fast site for that matter. From the same kind of perspective, is that you can rank without these traditional SEO factors coming into play?
Yes, I 100%. But if you're talking about like a super competitive space, obviously you need links. I'm not saying link building is dead or any of those other silly things that people would extrapolate from that statement. What I'm saying is that you can be effective and grow your positions from just content engineering.
Right. And would topical authority come into that as well, do you think?
Yeah, and I think that's another aspect that is not talked about enough. Like obviously Majestic has been real heavy on that. They've got the metrics to indicate topical authority and things like that. But I don't think people put enough value into that, and also the value of there being topical parity on both sides of a link. Because, you know, we all know if you build 1,000 links to a page, no matter where they come from, it's going to rank better. But you could also just build 5 links from pages that are directly relevant to what you're talking about, and it's going to rank better. So, you know, for me, it's all about like the value from the effort. And I prefer to do the things that are going to give me more value from doing less than, you know, building 1,000 links when I could have just built 5. So
right.
I agree that definitely topical authority comes into play.
Brilliant. And kind of like that idea of, I can't remember what you called it exactly, but Gary Lush was explaining the theory behind the bidding system that they have for the blue links, and then having those against the other elements such as videos and so on and so forth. And he was saying that it's a multiplier effect, which means that if you have one particularly weak element that has a score of less than 1, it will absolutely kill your entire strategy. And he was saying basically, and obviously he's from Google, so he's trying to get across a particular message, but it's better to be a straight C student than 3 A's and an F. Would that sound like a fair kind of comment? It was.
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
I agree. You know, I'm always careful with the Google propaganda, but I agree with that one.
Yeah, I mean, if you've got a spectacularly weak aspect to your content, then improving that is likely to have the biggest effect on the ranking of that content.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. I love that. It's a really nice way to finish it. Can we actually finish it by looking at your view? Because I've been thinking about that all the way through, probably not focusing enough on the conversation. This is the best view in the entire universe. I am so jealous of this view. And for people listening on the audio, we're looking out across, is it the Hudson River? Or is it a different river?
That's the Hudson. So what you're seeing, that small thing in the middle there, that's the Statue of Liberty. Over there is the what you call it, the World Trade Center. And then over here in the distance, that's the Verrazano Bridge. In my kitchen, you can see like the Empire State Building and all that other stuff too.
Brilliant. Wow. And you're the only person I've ever heard say, you see that small thing, it's the Statue of Liberty, because it's not small. Absolutely brilliant, Mike. That was delightful, incredibly informative. I loved that conversation. Now I'm just going to say thank you to everybody for watching. We're going to introduce Rebecca Burble, who's coming next week. There we go. Predictive SEO using big data. I talked to her and Andrea Volpini at Brighton SEO, and they were talking to me, or at me rather, about it, and I didn't know what they were talking about. And then one day I suddenly thought, oh, I think I've got an idea what that means. So I'm having Rebecca on the show because I want her to explain it to me properly. So before that, Mike, can you pass the baton to Rebecca for next week?
You got it. Rebecca, go ahead and kill it. Looking forward to it.
Brilliant. That was absolutely wonderful. So thank you, Mike. See you next week, Rebecca. A quick goodbye to end the show. Thank you, Mike.
That's amazing.
Oh, we did get a song. David was right. Thanks a lot, everybody. See you soon.